Last time we spoke about the entire Second Opium War of 1856 to 1860. The forces of Britain and France brought the Qing Dynasty to its knees, forcing yet again unequal treaties and humiliation. While the Opium Wars were certainly a large contributor to the century of humiliation, the story we're about to talk about is arguably a lot more significant. During that 5-part series, there was an ongoing and much more significant event occurring within China, that being one, if not the deadliest civil wars in human history, the Taiping Rebellion. Both the Taiping Rebellion and the Second Opium War are intertwined. They influenced another greatly, and together, they are a large reason for the eventual downfall of the Qing Dynasty. Now buckle up folks, because we are taking an extra long dive into an event that killed an estimated 20 to 30 million people. This episode is the Taiping Rebellion Part 1, Hong Xiuquan, the self-proclaimed brother of Jesus. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals is an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. I happen to have a 45-minute episode on the Taiping Rebellion there, so if you like visuals, give it a look. You might like it. Also, stay tuned for more news, but if you really like these podcasts, I'm considering making my own Patreon to cover even more topics that I can't cover here on other podcasts. But stating that, let's get on with the show. I first need to take a moment to explain something. I am literally writing this down after finishing the very last page of my first draft on the entire series, and without the last final touches, I can tell it's going to be something like a whopping 10 to 12 episodes long. Yes, oh my god. In no way was I expecting this. Hell, I thought it was going to be long for sure, but I was expecting something like 6 episodes, but not 12. But what really drove me to write so much, 99 pages to be exact, it was fantastic sources. I covered the Taiping Rebellion on my personal channel a very long time ago, and I had read quite a few books to do a 45-minute episode. But for this series, I decided to get down and read quite a few more books. In one of my sources, they look at the event from simply a religious point of view. Another source, which was much older, from the 1970s, explained the events in a large picture, kind of the old school way of doing history. Then a third source, which is a much more recent book that has come out, it looked at everything and it tied it up quite nicely. And most importantly, it had a lot of primary sources, a lot of quotes, the feelings of the people, and I mean the common people, not just the nobility. And after reading all of these sources, I couldn't bring myself to cut it down. I didn't want to summarize and leave things out. So I do apologize that it's going to be quite long. But I just wanted to say it here, that for all of you who can rough it out, I ensure it will be worth it. I am an enormous fan of Dan Carlin's hardcore history. Hate me if you want, I know some people don't like him. But the reason I bring him up is I believe that the series I have just created for the Taiping Rebellion is much the same as the way he does his series. I really wanted to get a flair for the intensity, the feelings of the people, the drama and everything. It's an incredible story filled with hardship, dramatic change, religion and insanity, and since the Qing Dynasty is involved, a hell of a lot of corruption. Stating all of that, I just want to thank you all. For those who've been listening, you guys are awesome, and I really greatly appreciate you all. If you want to reach out and suggest anything in the future, add some critique, say things you want to see changed, or perhaps you want me to cover subjects that I overlooked, please reach out to me, and I think the best means are just go to my YouTube channel and comment on some random video. I will see the comment. or if you're a Kings and Generals fan and you're on the Discord, you can shout out to me there. And I will note here that I plan on creating my own Patreon account, and if there are people who want specific subjects covered in a podcast, well, that's where you'll probably find it in the future, so just let me know. But stating all of that, please enjoy the Taiping Rebellion. In 1852, Theodor Hamburg, a young Swedish Protestant missionary with a thin, chin-strap beard, was in Hong Kong. He was one of the first Europeans of his generation to brave the Chinese countryside, as he left the relative safety of Hong Kong, which was by this time a British colony, to preach to a village 100 miles up the Pearl River. Hamburg was one of the first non-Chinese to learn and speak the dialect of the Hakka people. These people, as described by one of my sources, were a gypsy minority that thickly populated southern China. They are sometimes referred to as the guest people. All of this amounted to nothing of too much importance, save for one short, round-faced Hakka Hamburg converted named Hong Xiuquan. Hong Xiuquan had an incredible story to tell. Hamburg was surprised and found it a bit odd that a lot of the Hakka he met already knew about God and Jesus, despite these people being well beyond the narrow reach of Hong Kong missionaries. Hamburg listened to Hong Xiuquan recount stories of battles, armies, and congregations of Christian believers, all being led by a heavenly prophet. A Hakka one, no less. This prophet claimed to be hunted by the agents of the Qing Dynasty, and he lived in disguise under an assumed name. He was once kidnapped, but escaped and lived in a forest for 4 days and in a cave for 6 days. Hamburg confessed the stories this man told him were confusing, and, quote, "I could form no clear concept of the whole matter." Hamburg did not know what to make of it all, so he asked Hong Xiuquan to write these stories down for him. Hamburg would think little of all of this for nearly a year, but then in the spring of 1853, news came that Nanjing had fallen in a torrent of blood. It was then that Hamburg realized Hong Xiuquan's stories were quite real. News of the great upheaval in China reached those like Hamburg and Hong Kong and along the coast where foreigners did their business. Reports of local uprisings and small-scale banditry in the countryside were never anything of much importance. It was just the same old news in China. Then Catholic missionaries deep within the interior began to spread rumors of a larger movement, led by a man known as Jianda, or heavenly virtue. Some said the man was actually dead, killed by Qing forces. Others questioned his very existence. Without any concrete news, little attention was paid to any of it. Just some bandits disrupting the production of silk and tea, a common and reoccurring problem. But when Nanjing, the southern capital of China, fell in 1853, well, this suddenly brought attention to the foreigners that a very real and very large civil war was occurring in China. Those in Shanghai were alarmed, and rightfully so. Nanjing was very close to what was now called the Taiping Heavenly, the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. 1 million rebels were flooding down from central China on a grand flotilla of commandeered ships to what was formerly called Nanjing. A ton of cities were emptied and Qing defenses lay in rubble as these small local bandits were a grand rebel army on the march. Fear gripped the city of Shanghai. Communications with Nanjing were cut. Rumors spread that Shanghai would be next. Shanghai citizens boarded up their homes. Many of the Chinese fled into the countryside for safety. The foreign settlers called for defenses to be erected, for volunteers to take arms. British, French, and American steamers began to bring men to defend the walls of Shanghai. Yet there was no attack. At least not for the time being. Apparently, the Taiping rebels wanted to march upon Beijing, if it was to be believed. The capital of the Manchu were under threat from these rebels who held Nanjing. A single British vessel went over to Nanjing in April of 1853, but brought back very conflicting news of what was occurring there. It became the opinion of the British plenipotentiary at the time that the so-called Taiping were, quote, "nothing but superstition and nonsense." Despite the scarcity of clear information, raw accounts of this apparent civil war in China began to creep out of Shanghai and Hong Kong to the Western world. Tales that the Chinese were fed up with their Manchu rulers and were rising up spread. The Economist read, "A social change or convulsion, the kind that has afflicted Europe. It is singular to find similar commotions at the same time in Asia and Europe." Karl Marx, yes, the Karl Marx, wrote in 1853 as the London correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune about the situation going on in China. He considered the rebellion to be a symptom of China's integration into the global economy, as a result of Britain's opening up of China during the First Opium War. What was happening in China was not merely a rebellion, it was a formidable revolution, one that demonstrated the interconnectedness of the industrial world. Marx argued what was happening in China would come to Europe. He had this to say: "The next uprising of the people of Europe and their movement for republican freedom and economy of government may depend more probably on what is now passing in the Celestial Empire, the very opposite of Europe, than any other political cause that now exists." The disorder that China faced was caused by the opium trade and exposure to the world. The old was facing the new, as they say, and Marx believed, "Dissolution must follow as surely as that of any mummy carefully preserved in a hermetically sealed coffin, whenever it is brought into contact with open air." Marx argued the Qing Dynasty may dissolve, and that it would not be limited to just China. The whole Taiping Revolution for Marx was Britain's fault, and now the effects of her actions overseas would go back to bite her in the ass at home. The question is how that revolution will in time react on England, and through England on Europe. Marx predicted the loss of the Chinese market because of the Taiping would undermine British exports, particularly the textile industry. By the way, as I've pointed out in previous episodes, that very much was not the case. Textiles from Britain actually went up because of the Taiping Rebellion, killing the Chinese trade network internally, resulting in foreigners making up for the demand. But then again, when has Marx ever been right about anything? And yes, those are shots fired. Marx believed the Taiping Revolution would cut off England's source of tea imports, and that the price of tea would spike in England, leading to the economic downfall and further revolution across Europe. It may be safely argued that the Chinese Revolution will throw the spark into the overloaded mine of the present industrial system and cause the explosion of a long-prepared general crisis, which, spreading abroad, will closely be followed by political revolutions on the continent. Many news outlets and intellectuals had differing accounts of what exactly the Taiping were, and what the hell was going on in China. Some made analogies to the African slaves rebelling in the United States, to that of the Chinese under the Manchu. Yet almost no one had any real explanation for the origin of the movement. It's rather funny to say, one of the very best accounts to explain all of it could have been found in a desk in Hong Kong on some scribbled pieces of paper that Theodor Hamburg had shoved into his desk. Hong Rengan came back to Hamburg at a village outside Canton, but this time the Swedish missionary knew the man for who he was. He was the cousin and lifelong companion of the prophet of the Taiping, the Heavenly King. Hong Rengan was the only person to come into contact with a foreigner who had first-hand knowledge of the Taiping, and that of their leader. Hamburg and Hong Rengan formed a close friendship. Hamburg even got to baptize Hong Rengan in September of 1853. Hamburg educated the man in Lutheran doctrine, preparing him to serve as an assistant to the foreign preachers and eventually take their brand of Christianity over to the Taiping in Nanjing. As they worked together, Hamburg kept asking Hong Rengan about the movement, stories of the man who started it. And so it is here we can now learn about the famous Hong Xiuquan. Hong Rengan told the story of his cousin, Hong Xiuquan, who was 9 years older and had always been brilliant. They lived in a neighboring village roughly 30 miles away from Canton. Many of the villagers were relatives of their clan, which back in the Qing Dynasty had been a grand one, with countless high officials and imperial advisors amongst their ranks. Yet as time passed, they all became poor farmers. One thing they held with great esteem was a small schoolhouse where Hong Xiuquan began studying the Confucian classics at the age of 7. He was extremely gifted and he spent years memorizing the 4 books, the 5 classics, and other necessary texts required for the civil service examinations. When Hong Xiuquan was a teen, he was very well read on Chinese history and literature. He was even able to read ancient texts without assistance. His family dreamed that he would restore their family to its former glory, and several teachers worked without pay to provide him with the knowledge he would need to pass the exams to become a Qing official. As time went on, his educative needs took him outside the village, and his family got together all the money that they could to support the 16-year-old who at this point was already supporting himself as a school teacher with a small salary paid in lard, salt, rice, and lamp oil. Now, the key to gaining an official appointment in the Qing government was passing the Confucian civil service examinations, and this was a goal shared by both Hong cousins. But the exams were extremely difficult, and if you failed an attempt, you had to wait years for another opportunity to take them. The exam process took 3 days in a small cubicle in Canton. Hong Rengan never had much success, but Hong Xiuquan ranked high on the first day of his first attempt in 1827. As the grueling exam went on, he began to slip through the ranks, and by the end of the 3rd day, he fell out of the winner's circle. It was to be 9 more years before he could qualify again to take the exam in 1836. And I just have to say, wow to that. I thought it was brutal trying to gain entry into a graduate program at my university for neurobehavioral sciences, but that is pretty rough, 9 years waiting. Well, Hong Xiuquan did not give up. He took the exam a 2nd time, and he failed. Hong Rengan likewise failed, but unlike Hong Xiuquan, he was not carrying the entire family's hope upon his shoulders. Thus, between the 2 cousins, it ended up being Hong Xiuquan who succumbed to a mental breakdown. Hong Xiuquan had his first visions in 1837, right after failing the examination for a 3rd time. He was greatly weakened by the ordeal, and he had to be carried home afterwards. When he got home, he simply collapsed into bed and called for his family to crowd around him. He apologized to them, and he said his life was over. He had all let them down. It is said he closed his eyes and lost all strength. Many thought he was dead. Eventually he woke up and he began telling his family about these strange dreams he was having. In his dreams, a dragon, a tiger, and a rooster entered his room, followed by musicians in a sedan chair. They all carried him away to a wondrous and beautiful place full of people who rejoiced when they saw him, and an old woman washed him to remove all defilements from his body. Then a group of old men appeared, and he recognized some of them to be the sages of ancient China. They opened up his body with a knife and removed his organs, replacing them with new, healthier ones before closing him up. Not a trace of any incision could be found afterwards. He was escorted back to a grand hall where an old man in a black robe with a flowing golden beard sat upon a throne. That man said to him, "They take of my gifts, and they therewith worship demons. They purposely rebel against me, and arouse my anger. Do not thou imitate them." The man then gave him a magical sword for which he said its purpose was to kill demons. But he told him to never use it on his brothers or sisters. Alongside this was a seal and a piece of yellow fruit which he ate. The old man had led him to look upon the people of Earth, where they could see both the defilement and perversions. Hong's visions continued for 40 days, and Hong Rengan was one of those who was stuck by his side, listening to his waking stories. There were other recurring characters in his dreams. One was a middle-aged man he referred to as Elder Brother, who traveled with him to the far regions of the world to slay demons with his magical sword. The old man in black at some points began berating Confucius for failing to teach proper doctrine to the Chinese people, and Confucius confessed guilt and shame as to such. Those around Hong Xiuquan say he often leapt out of bed screaming, "Kill the demons!" while he slashed wildly into the thin air. His clear insanity drew at first curiosity and amusement of his neighbors, who came to see the famous sleeping madman. At one point he woke up and he claimed to be the Emperor of China. Hong Rengan said to Hamburg, His friends and relatives only replied, "The whole thing was strange indeed," without thinking at the time that there was any reality in the matter. Eventually Hong Xiuquan recovered, and he was a completely different person. He was apparently taller, stronger, more intelligent. He seemed more handsome, fair-skinned, and his gaze had, quote, become piercing and difficult to endure. He seemed healthier, and he quickly returned to his teaching, and he prepared for another attempt at the civil service exams. In 1843, he tried for a fourth time, and he failed yet again. This poor guy. That same year, Hong Xiuquan found a Christian text that a missionary had given him years prior in Canton, and he decided to read it. Upon reading the text closely, he came to an epiphany. The book seemed to unlock the secret of his dream visions over the past 6 years. He suddenly realized the old man in the black robes with the golden beard was God, and that his elder brother who helped him slay demons was none other than Jesus Christ. The demons were the idols worshipped by the Chinese that believed in Confucian and Buddhism. But Hong Xiuquan's real brothers and sisters were that of the Christian Chinese people. Hong Xiuquan baptized himself, and he threw away the Confucian text within his classroom. Hong Rengan became Hong Xiuquan's first convert, followed by a neighbor named Fang Yunshan. They all baptized themselves in a river and cast away the Confucian idols from their classrooms. The three men began to study together, gathering Christian texts wherever they could find them. Hong Xiuquan preached to them, and soon others began to join the flock. Hong Xiuquan believed the Bible was literally written for him. The converts first came from parents, siblings, extended family, and such. It was by no means easy. For example, Hong Rengan's older brother beat him up with a stick for losing students at a local school he taught, after the Confucian tablets were cast away. Hong Xiuquan and Feng Yunshan both left their villages in 1844 to spread the gospel to other villages throughout the province of Guangxi. Hong Rengan desperately wanted to join them, but his relatives forced him to stay and remain a school teacher because he was only 20 years old. Hong Rengan was forced to bring back the Confucian texts and idols so that his students would return. But even so, he simultaneously baptized at least 50 new converts. So Hong and Feng preached from village to village throughout Guangxi, and the movement spread. Autonomous congregations sprang up, numbering in hundreds, who began to refer to themselves as the God worshippers. They took the man named Hong Xiuquan, whom many had not even met, as their prophetic leader. Hong Xiuquan came back home in 1845, preaching the gospel while disparaging the Manchu in the Qing Dynasty and Confucianism. He said things like this: God has divided the kingdoms of the world, and they made the ocean to be a boundary for them, just as a father divides his estates amongst his sons. Why should these Manchu forcibly enter China and rob their brothers of their estate? His religious movement, thus, was becoming a bit of a political one. By 1847, the God worshippers grew to around 2,000, made up mostly of Hakka. They began to smash Buddhist idols and temples, and all this was driving ire from the Qing authorities. Then in 1850, a pestilence ravaged Guangxi province, and rumors spread that Hong Xiuquan's prayers to the Christian God could heal those sick of the infliction. This exponentially increased their ranks, and the passing of the disease gave credit to Hong Xiuquan's religion. Yet despite all of this, they were no army. Then some small violence broke out amongst Hakka settlers in Guangxi province. Some Hakka settlers were scrambling to find land and water rights, and the long-standing local families, who, many of which were not Hakka, were unhappy, and they felt like these were encroachments. This led to a small-scale war between Hakka and other villagers in the autumn of 1850. The non-Hakka burned the homes of some Hakka, and this led them to turn to the God worshippers for protection and help. Local authorities had already been suspicious of the sect, and now began to view them more so as troublemakers. According to Hong Rengan, Hong Xiuquan predicted all of this, and he was waiting patiently to make his move. As the Hakka versus other villager violence spread, Qing officials placed blame squarely upon the Hakka, and sent a detachment of soldiers to arrest Hong Xiuquan and Feng Yunshan. The god worshippers heard of the incoming threat and they began to arm themselves with swords and spears to defend their leader. And for those of you who've heard my previous podcast on the White Lotus Rebellion, yes, it is eerily similar. The Qing detachment was easily overwhelmed and routed. Hong Xiuquan sent word calling out for all the god worshippers to gather for the very first time and to prepare for what he called the next step of their great movement. Countless members sold their homes and lands and marched. The following days saw tens of thousands gathering. The god worshipper leaders told the converts to converge on a town named Jinjian, and soon a force of 10 to 30,000 seized the town. In preparation for an open rebellion, Hong Xiuquan began organizing the people into military formations, each led by commanders with military ranks. The Qin Army Corps consisted of 13,156 men, divided into 5 shi, those are regiments, of 2,500 men with officers. Each shi was divided into 5 liu of 500 men, and each had 5 ci companies of 100. Each ci had 5 liang platoons of 25 men with a sergeant. A liang was made up of 4 wu squads of privates with a corporal. This military breakdown was based on some of the Ming Dynasty's military formations back in the day. Now, the Qing garrison of Guangxi was not particularly strong at this time, as they were dealing with countless other uprisings. This is 19th century China after all. Not a year would go by without a few. The Qing commander at Xunzhou, Li Duanyuan, led the Qing forces to attack Hong Xiuquan's residence within the village of Huanzhou Sharen in Pingnan County. It was quite a dangerous situation, but both Hong Xiuquan and Feng Yushan were both saved by reinforcements sent by Yang Xiuqing, and thus the god worshippers retained Jinjian. Then a Qing force led by Zhou Fengqi, alongside his subordinate Li Duanyuan, attacked Jinjian and erected a siege of the town. The god worshippers anticipated this and they ambushed the Qing forces along the way to Jinjian at a smaller village called Caijiang, near Thistle Mountain. The Qing forces were ambushed by the god worshippers by both men and women wielding pikes and halberds. The Qing forces were defeated, and one of their ranking officers was killed in battle. Then on January the 11th of 1851, Hong Xiuquan's birthday, the god worshippers proclaimed an uprising in Jinjian, and Hong Xiuquan declared the founding of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, with himself as its new emperor, or better said, heavenly king. Feng Yunshan, alongside 3 others, were appointed the kings of 4 directions. Feng Yunshan was the South King, Wei Changhui was the North King, Xiao Chaogui was the West King, and Yang Xiuqing was the East King. Eventually there was also an additional king, the Flank King, who was Shi Dakai. These men would control roughly 100,000 people each, including their own army. Hong Xiuquan ordered the god worshippers to cut their Manchu queues off as a universal symbol of severing their allegiance to the Qing dynasty. Many of the Taiping would go on letting their long hair grow, leading to the nickname, Chang Mao Tse, long-haired bandits. Now from 1851 to 1852, the Taiping army began to fight its way north, absorbing the poor, the disfranchised, the criminals, and all those other groups who hated their Manchu overlords. It was a blend of those seeking to be part of something, to join the religious aspect of it, or those who simply hated the Qing dynasty and sought to overthrow it. Yes, it's very much like the White Lotus Rebellion 2.0. Now, I had mentioned there was another rebellion going on. In fact, if you look up a list of how many rebellions were taking place in 19th century China, well, it's just comical. It's insane. Seriously, pause this podcast right now, go on Wikipedia, and just look it up. It's a very long list. One of these rebellions was led by the Tenji Hui, and a large reason the Taiping won at Jinjian was because of the Qing being too busy dealing with said Tenji Hui. After the victory at Jinjian, many of the Tenji Hui joined them, bolstering their ranks. Meanwhile, the Qing began tossing more and more forces at the ever-growing Taiping menace. General Xiangrong led 3,000 men, and he was aided by other Qing forces led by General Li Nangchen and General Zhou Fengqi. The idea was simple. The forces would converge and encircle the rebels. Their three armies attacked the Taiping at Dahuangjiankou on February the 18th. As they approached the town from the west and the east, they ran straight into minefields set up by the Taiping, and then they were ambushed, leading to hundreds of casualties. The Qing forces were eventually forced to stop their offensive and hunker down for a long siege. Now, something important to note is what exactly are the Qing forces I'm speaking of? If you remember during my Opium Wars episodes, I explained the difference between the Green Standard Army and the Eight Banner Army. To brutally summarize, the Manchu armies that conquered the Ming used the banner system, with each colored banner being a different group. Well, the Eight Banner Army by the turn of the 19th century had become sort of a ceremonial guards type force. They were deployed predominantly around the Beijing area and in the north, and, to be frank, they were extremely ineffective as a large standing force, and thus the Green Standard Army was formed as, well, there was a need for a more standard army. The Green Standard Army can be seen more as like a police force, but when the White Lotus Rebellion broke out, they proved to be quite ineffective and they were in the decline. The major reasons for this was because their pay did not rise with inflation, requiring many to seek additional work. They were also widely dispersed, preventing centralized training. More often than not, their ranks came about only in times of conflict. Rampant corruption from higher officials led to embezzlement, and I mean insane levels. A lot of armies left their rosters unfilled, so officers could simply pocket soldiers' pay and pretend they were leading more men than they actually had. Soldiers literally could hire substitutes, often poor people, to train and fight in their place. There was also an overall lack of morale and discipline. And the ultimate culprit at the time was, of course, opium addiction. The reason I bring this up is because, much like the White Lotus Rebellion, the Qing officials would find the Eight Banner Army and the Green Standard Army unable to cope with the task of quelling a rebellion, and would be forced to find a new alternative way to find armies. This very well became a major reason for the downfall of the Qing Dynasty, and why China would find itself in a warlord era from 1916 to 1928. Something I am currently writing a 7-part series about on my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel. A lame plug, I know, please forgive me. But do note the warlord era is fascinating and the Taiping period holds a lot of its root. Many of the historic figures that rise up during the Taiping Rebellion end up being what influences future warlords to rise up. It's quite an interesting dichotomy when you look at the figures. It also influenced communism and Mao Zedong. Anyways, back to the story. Now, when the Qing began to strangle the Taiping managed to break out again at night on the 10th of March and marched towards the east village of Wuxian County. The Qing forces pursued them, but every time they got near the Taiping, they were ambushed. The Taiping and Qing eventually found themselves in a stalemate near Sanyi Dike. In early April, the governor of Guangxi province, Zhou Tianjue, and General Xiangrong rallied 6,000 troops to attack the east village, but yet again the rebels repelled them. By May, the Qing were losing more and more men when the Taiping broke out of another siege and marched towards Xiangzhou. General Xiangrong decided to coordinate a net strategy, and he had the aid of General Wu Lantai stationed at Liangshan village, while his men would strike out from Jue Ridge. The Taiping fought the two Qing forces at the Battle of Duao Ridge, just due north of Liangshan village, and General Wu Lantai's force was smashed. Despite the major Qing losses, they still had managed to encircle the Taiping for a 4th time. The Taiping fought a major war of attrition until July, when they finally pulled out of Xiangzhou to a former base of operations at Mount Ziqing in Guiping. The path north was effectively blocked to the Taiping by the Qing forces, but the entire time, and everywhere the Taiping went, they converted more and more to their cause. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel over at YouTube. where I have my own 45-minute episode on the Taiping Rebellion, a 7-part series on the Warlord era, and I'm possibly looking into creating a Patreon where I might talk about many of the rebellions that take place in 19th century China that I can't talk about here. If that's something you're interested in, please let me know. And so, the self-proclaimed brother of Jesus Christ, Hong Xiuquan, gathered his flock and chose to wage a war on the demon Manchu, who sat upon the dragon throne. Hong Xiuquan and his kings now march forward to their destiny.